Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Today is the day. Everyone receives a connection card when they walked in. If you didn't, please raise your hand. Ushers or greeters will get you one. On the back, it says prayer request. And there's pens available. And I'd like you to write the following words and help me a little bit. Today is the day. Today is the day. Today is the day. My courage overcomes. Today is the day my courage overcomes. And I'll let you fill in what's relevant today in your day. And I'll fill in what's relevant in my day. The theme of today's talk, the message, the lesson is courage. Not bravery. I'm going to go into spiritual courage. And so I read a story about a psychology professor at the University of Miami. And he knew, this professor knew that all of the students were expecting a terrifyingly long and detailed final exam. And did I mention he was a psychology professor? Okay, he's a psychology professor. To play with their minds, he put one question on the exam. One question. And he watched as everybody had the exam on their desk, and they all had to turn it over at once. And he watched their faces. He watched their reactions as the students opened up the exam and saw only one question. Remember, they were expecting a long, drawn-out, detailed essay exam, and there was one question. And initially, they all looked very relieved and very, very happy, until they pondered the depth of the question, and the question itself began to sink in. And the professor watched all of these relieved faces turn to confusion and turn to joy, turn to fear. Except there was one student. There was one student that didn't miss a beat. Because obviously he read the question, he tapped, his pencil or pen on the desk a few times, gave it a moment's thought, jotted down the answer. He stood up, walked up to the professor, handed the exam in, and walked out of the room. And if you've ever been in one of those exams where like somebody finishes an hour before you, you know what that does to your own personal blood pressure and pulse. All right, you're like, ugh. And so all the other students don't believe it, but the professor was most surprised at all. And so he turns over, he looks at the answer, he takes a pen, marks a big A on the exam, and puts it down. The question that the professor asked the class for their final exam is, what is courage? The two-word answer that the student wrote on the paper, walked up and handed in, said, "This is." Courage, we know it when we see it, yet it's so hard to describe. Eight short years ago, I would never have imagined that I would be a minister of a church. I got the idea many times in my life, but it was far too easy to dismiss it. Truthfully, even 1 year ago, there were thoughts that in my own head that I might not even be here today. And so we talk about courage and how courage overcomes fears that show up in our life. And Chris Gardner, he writes in a chapter called No Testimony, he writes, the majority of the correspondence that I receive comes from people of all ages who've had their own experience of life happens. You ever have one of those days where life happens? Anybody? Is anybody alive? Oh, all right, just checking. Life happens. And all of our circumstances, very dramatically. All of our circumstances vary dramatically. But what we have in common in our ordeals is suddenly having to pass the hardest test of all, the one that brings us face to face with our fears, the test that lets us know who we are and reveals whether we have the courage to stand on faith at the most uncertain points. Now understand, every one of us, I believe, can think of a few uncertain points in our life. I'll bet that everyone here knows a little bit about courage. And I would even beg to bet that if we think about it, we didn't focus on being courageous. It happened naturally. And then we looked back and realized how powerful we truly were. This is inherent in courage. You see, there's a great song that they sing, and it says, when you've done all that you can, just stand. And I believe that's what courage allows us to do, to stand in the truth of who we are and express the truth of the power in us without giving up any of our determination or commitment or our dreams or our visions to the circumstances of a situation that was an uncertain point in our life. And so today, I want to talk about courage from a spiritual understanding. And in Unity, we have a book called The Revealing Word, and it defines many of those religious and theological buzzwords we grew up with. But nobody really ever told us what they meant. And as courage, Charles Fillmore says courage is a spiritual quality. So let's remember that it is a spiritual quality that enables us to remain poised and centered in God amidst great difficulties and great dangers. And so it's a quality that allows us to stand in the truth that every one of us is a son or a daughter of God in our spiritual nature, and courage comes from our spiritual self. We never weigh and balance the pros and cons between the fears and the doubts and the dangers and the difficulties and our power and our courage and our strength and our faith, and then say, well, I'll choose faith and courage. Do you understand? It doesn't happen that way, because once we move out of our spirit, out of our heart, into our head, I believe our head takes over. And when our head takes over, we usually give in to the fear. He continues and he says, the realization that an almighty God of the universe is a spiritual presence fills us with courage, new courage, and a fearlessness that is beyond description. And that's what that professor in the story about the professor was sharing, to open up that ultimately courage is beyond description.